Okay, let's go back and let's ask, what is your second area that you want to get into?
So I want to look at how the doctrine of exclusivity, as I'm calling it, so how Islam basically took on its own form. Islam, at some point, became a separate religion entirely from, for example, Christianity or Judaism. Whereas in the early communities, I'm going to make an argument that they were much more inclusive and much more accepting, not just of monotheists in general, but also of Christians and Jews and potentially other groups. So let's dig into that now. So first of all, this argument is not something new. This is the work of Fred Donner. Fred Donner is someone who advocates for this very perspective. In his book, Muhammad and the Believers, you can read the theory that he puts forward that in early Islam, it was a case that Muhammad was with monotheists. He was also with Christians and Jews. And he wanted to unify them in some sense, so that rather than Christians, Jews, and general monotheists being their own separate groups, they would all come together and be unified in one religion, and that religion later being known as Islam. So we read here, the early community of believers was open to all who accepted belief in one God. So that was key. So he's looking at monotheists and trying to unify monotheists in a way that hadn't previously been done, because the monotheists were split into different groups, whether it was rabbinic Judaism, whether it was Christianity, and of course, what form of Christianity. There may have been different forms, but he's trying to unify the monotheists and exclude the polytheists. And the Day of Judgment, and committed themselves to righteous living, regardless of their prior religious affiliations. So Fred Donner makes the point that the Quran and the early sources seem to be very keen on piety, very keen on pious ways of living. And that, of course, gets tied up into belief in one God, belief in the resurrection, belief in the previous books. And ultimately, that's kind of the main thrust of the Quran. The Quran is wanting to invite different monotheist groups, Christians, Jews, potentially other groups like Sabeans and Zoroastrians, potentially. And he wants to invite them to just this ecumenical belief. So is there any actual support for this? Yes, the Quran actually contains quite a bit of support for the idea that the early Islamic community was quite ecumenical. We read in Surah Baqarah, Surah 2, Ayah 62. Indeed, those who believed and those who were Jews or Christians or Sabeans, Sabeans are not quite known in scholarship exactly who that's referring to, but let's focus on the Jews and Christians. Those among them who believed in Allah, which of course seems to be implied in this that the Christians and Jews do, and the last day, which these groups did, and did righteousness, which these groups did, will have their reward with their Lord, and no fear will there be concerning them, nor will they grieve. This seems to be quite clear that they will potentially be in Jannah. They will potentially be in paradise. Christians and Jews have a method, both at the time of the revealing of the Quran and prior, that they can actually get to heaven using just their scriptures, just what they have, which is really, really interesting, because it implies that those scriptures are, of course, valid and authoritative. But it also shows that the Quran is not claiming that only Muslims will get to heaven. That's not a claim of the Quran. The Quran is quite clear in these verses, and we'll go on to show some more as well, that actually it's whoever just follows God in the correct way. And the Quran makes it clear that Jews and Christians, there are some of those people in those groups that do follow God in the correct way, and hence will be going to heaven. Is this what is taught in modern Islam? No, modern Islam does not teach that at all. Modern Islam actually questions this very deeply, and they actually say, if you deny Muhammad, you are not going to Jannah, regardless of what you do as a Christian, a practicing Christian, or a practicing rabbinic Jew. You do have to believe in Muhammad. Otherwise, you will not get into Jannah. So the modern doctrine, again, is radically different from the doctrine that was adopted by the early believers, which was vastly more inclusive. Let's take a look at some of the verses. So we see here in Surah 3, Surah Al-Imran, Ayah 113, yet they are not all alike. There are some among people of the book who are upright, who recite Allah's revelations throughout the night, prostrating in prayer. So clearly, people of the book being Christians and Jews, clearly there are some Christian and Jews who do actually act according to God's revelation that has been given to them previously. And that is a good thing according to the Quran, and they will be rewarded for it. The next verse says, they believe in Allah and on the last day, encourage good and forbid evil, which of course invokes the question as how do the Christians and Jews encourage good and forbid evil? Surely they must have a reliable and preserved scripture that's authoritative to do that. And race with one another in doing good. They are truly among the righteous. And of course, those among the righteous in the Quran's perspective go to Jannah. And then we can go to the same chapter, verse 199. Indeed, there are some among the people of the book who truly believe in Allah, which implies they have correct theological understanding of Allah, and what has been revealed to you, believers, and what has been revealed to them. So now this is where the Quran makes a subcategory where it says, okay, there's actually Christians and Jews who have a correct belief in God. They've then gone on to also accept what Muhammad is teaching. They humble themselves before Allah, never trading Allah's revelations for a fleeting gain. Their reward is with their Lord. Surely Allah is swift in reckoning. Now, I want to look at some historical sources as well to back up this idea. So Fred Donner mentions this in his book, Muhammad and the Believers, that when we look at the historical account, we can see that when Islam or the early caliphate, the righteous caliphs...
Can we just back up? Can we just back up that last slide? Let me just add another one that's very clear, and that's chapter 5, verse 111 in the Quran, where it's even clearer. It says, and when I, that's Allah, inspired the Hawariyan, which would be the disciples of Isa, to believe in me and my messenger, they said, we believe and bear witness that we, that means the Jews and the Christians, are Muslims. So there you have even a very specific allocation that at this time when the Quran is written, it looked like the Jews and the Christians were right along with them at that time.
That's a really interesting point. It's worth noting as well that other scholars like Gabriel Reynolds point out that the Quran seems to be written in a polemical way. It's using literary devices to try to encourage the Christians and Jews to obviously become Muslims in the sense that they believe in Muhammad and join this wider ecumenical community. And the Quran is trying to do this through polemical language. And so it often blurs Christians and Jews with Muslims to say that, hey, the good ones are the ones that have also accepted us. If you see like where that's going. And then, of course, anyone who explicitly denies Muhammad, that's not a good Christian. That's not a good Jewish person because they're not properly following their scriptures, because their scriptures, of course, mention Muhammad, or at least that's the claim that Muhammad makes in the Quran in Surah 7, Ayah 157.
There's lots of verses that do that, Chris. You have chapter 9, verse 29, that refers to those who don't believe in Allah and his prophet and those who don't in the last days. So there are those, the good Christians and the bad Christians. And it seems to be that the shibboleth that they're looking for is Allah and his prophet, Allah and his prophet. You always have to be, those are the category. If you don't believe in those two things, then you're in the wrong camp. You're on the outside of there. But sir, but this is fascinating because what you are saying is there seems to be a Quranic view that there were these Muslims and Christians that were part of the Ummah.
Yes, it seems to be the case. If we look at the Quran critically and we look at these verses, it seems to be very clear there is a seat at the table, so to speak, for Christians and Jews in the religion of Islam. And that's not what Muslims teach today. They teach that rather Islam is an exclusive religion just for those who accept Muhammad and the Quran. And if you don't do that, if you don't accept everything that comes through the Hadith tradition and so on, then you're not going to heaven. But that doesn't seem to be what the Quran is teaching.
All right.
So let's take a look at some historical sources. And again, I got this from Fred Donner's book. We have the Maronite Chronicle, which actually quotes, and this is in regards to Muawiyah, one of the later caliphs. It talks about how many Arabs gathered Jerusalem and made Muawiyah king, and he went up and sat down at Golgotha. Golgotha, of course, is a very significant place from a Christian perspective, the place where Christ was crucified. He prayed there and went to Gethsemane and went down to the tomb of the Blessed Mary to pray in it. This, of course, is a very ecumenical action if the Caliph Muawiyah is meant to be a Islamic caliph. He's meant to be a ruler of the Islamic Empire. That's a very strange thing to do if there was already this understanding that Islam was a distinct religion and there was no need to have this kind of interaction with the Christian tradition. But rather, it seems as if, no, at least Caliph Muawiyah was very comfortable in interacting with the Christian tradition. He didn't seem to have any issue with this whatsoever. And keep in mind, Golgotha being the place of Christ's crucifixion is explicitly denied in Surah 4, Ayah 157 of the Quran, according to the Orthodox perspective. So, according to his beliefs, supposedly, he would have no reason to go to Golgotha whatsoever. And yet, according to this source, he supposedly did go to Golgotha and even prayed there. Then we go to the maintaining and building of churches. We can see that there wasn't an immediate and very deliberate and intense era of persecution immediately after the early caliphs invaded places like Syria, Damascus, even the holy lands of Jerusalem. When they had taken over these areas, they did allow for churches to persist for a period of time. Now, this isn't to say that they weren't discriminated against, but it is to say that they at least recognized them and their right to exist for a period of time. In fact, we even have accounts here. I've included a picture of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Damascus. It was actually used by both Christians and Muslims side by side. There was actually a dedicated Muslim area, and then a dedicated, I think it kind of swapped at some point, and then the Muslims took over the majority of it until eventually it became a mosque. But it's interesting that that was occurring up until 706 AD. So you're looking at roughly around 70 years after Muhammad died. And of course, as well, going back to Muawiyah, we have the Greek inscription. We can see very clearly there, the very first character appears to be a cross, which would be a Christian inscription. This mentions Muawiyah as well as public baths and talks about them, I think, either opening or closing. And again, quite interesting that whoever wrote this didn't feel the need to remove the cross, which, of course, if Muawiyah was already a very well-developed Muslim in that he had this later theology that Muslims claim was always the case, you would have thought that Christians would not have been permitted to put crosses next to inscriptions of Muawiyah. And you would have also thought that a Christian wouldn't have even wanted to, because Muawiyah would not have been in any way tolerant to Christians. He wouldn't have been inclusive of them. But of course, as we saw in the previous source, Muawiyah does seem to be inclusive of Christians, which implies that he had a very different view to how Muslims today see Christianity. He saw it as something that was a valid way of getting to Jannah in his mind.
Okay, just take a look at that inscription. That's the inscription at Taif from 663. Now, for those who don't know, Muawiyah reigned from 661 up until 680. So we're talking about we're talking about 30 years after Muhammad died. So this is after the rightly guided caliphs, if the historical traditions are correct. And he is supposedly he is the first caliph of the Umayyad dynasty, which is, according to the standard Islamic narrative, this is in a Muslim dynasty. Now look at that. If you look at it, you notice it's written in Greek. Who writes in Greek? Do Muslims write in Greek, or do Christians write in Greek?
It would be Christians.
So this is a Greek text, script. Now, it is Arabic, written. You can see Abdullah. You can see that he's Abdullah, Mu'awiyah the Abdullah, and also the Mu'minin. He is the leader of the leader of the believers. What believers is it referring to? Is there anything Islamic on that inscription? Obviously, the believers, if the cross is up on the far left, then the believers have to be Christians. So where is this idea that Mu'awiyah is a Muslim? And I don't see it anywhere on this text. Only Christians write in Greek. That's the sacred language of Christianity at that time, in the 7th century. And it's fascinating to me that if this is an ecumenism, and maybe he's just trying to be ecumenical, as you're suggesting, that could well be. That's what Donner would suggest. But that's only if you look at these inscriptions from a standard Islamic narrative perspective. Because it's the standard Islamic narrative that tells you he's a Muslim. But there's nothing in the 7th century that tells you he's a Muslim, because the standard Islamic narrative doesn't even begin to appear until the 9th century. And that's only a redaction of 200 years back and putting this on Mu'awiyah. So I would suggest that either this is strong ecumenism, or this is a strong viewpoint, historically speaking, that the Christians and the Arabs at this time, and they could very well have been Christian Arabs, because I don't see anything Muslim about this inscription or about what you've shown in the churches Those churches continued for quite a few years. You say up until 706, that's about the time that Islam starts to appear. Well into the 8th century is when they really, even the word doesn't say, you don't find the word Muslim at all in the 7th century. That doesn't appear until around 730. 730, that's well into, even look at John of Damascus. He doesn't call them Muslims, he calls them Ishmaelites. Heresy of the Ishmaelites, he calls them. So anyway, just to bring that in there from a historical standpoint, I agree with Donor, but I think Donor hasn't gone far enough. I think we're going to find out that this ecumenism is really, it's either very strong ecumenism where they're giving an awful lot of leeway to the Christians and the Jews and the Sabeans who were there, or maybe there was not Muslims yet. Anyhow, back to you again.
That's a really interesting point, Jay. Just to add as well, the Arabic term mu'minin, and forgive me, I do butcher this, and people point that out to me. But the term mu'minin is found in Surah, I believe it's 85 of the Quran, where it describes those who were burnt alive in the trench, who were supposedly Christians in Najran or in Yemen, in the Himyarite kingdom, it was known as at the time, by the Jewish king Dhu Nuwas. Which is interesting because that would be a reference in the Quran to a known Christian group as part of the Mu'minin.
There you go again.
Okay. Very interesting. So yes, very briefly, there are also coins as well that we can look at, and we can see development in the coins, and we can also see how there is hesitancy to include, there is a willingness to include Christian, and actually not even just Christian, but Zoroastrian as well, symbols on the coins for a prolonged period of time. So again, you could see this in, I guess, Fred Donner's perspective or your perspective, Jay, whether we want to say this is evidence of ecumenism, that they're basically just, they have no issue actually with the Christian religion as such at this point in history, because they see it as just a form of monotheism and they don't have an issue with that. Or we could see it as, well, actually, hang on a second. This shows that the early Muslims supposedly are not acting in a way that is according to our understanding of Islam. And that could be evidence to say that perhaps Muslim doctrines did not come at this point in time, but actually were derived much later.
Those coins that you have right there, do you know what? Do you know, actually, that's not Muawiyah's. Those are Abd al-Malik's coins. The one at the top is actually a coin that was minted in 693, where you have Abd al-Malik himself on the coin,
which is
holding the sword, having just won the battle with the emperor, the Byzantine emperor at that time. And this is a victory coin. And then the one below that, I have that coin. I have it in fact, I bought that coin. That's a gold solidus, not the one that you're showing. I've got my own. And notice he's taken his image off and he has only script there. When you read all that script, these are all anti-Trinitarian attacks against the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus Christ. Say not three, for God is one, and he has no son. That's on there. That's now in chapter 4, verse 171. For God does not begetteth, nor is he begotten. That comes out of chapter 112 out of the Quran, in the Quran today. And then if you look carefully, right in the middle there is a La ilaha illa Muhammad Rasulullah. So there's the Muhammad, the Rasulullah. There, I'm not saying Muhammad, I'm saying Muhammad for a reason, because that's what it would be in the Arabic at that time without any vowelization. That's the Shahada. That's where it's introduced. The Shahada is first introduced on that coin that you see, actually the front above it and the one below it. These are 693 and 696. This is late into the 7th century that you start getting this attack against the Trinity, attack against his divinity, and against his sonship. For God has no son. And then in the backside of the one on the bottom, it does talk about the Mu'awiyahs. Not Mu'awiyah, sorry. What is the Mushrikuns? The Mushrikuns. Those are the associators. That the associators, which would be the Christians, those who associate any alongside God, who commit shirk. Un would be plural, masculine, that they are the ones that will be defeated, and that truly we will defeat them. But it doesn't say who we are. There's nothing there about Muslim. There's nothing about Islam on any of that coins. But this is the beginning of the attack against not just Christians, but specific Christians, Trinitarian Christians who believe Jesus is divine. So I would suggest that these are showing an internecine anti-Trinitarian, an Arian attack against those who are Trinitarians. We've had this problem since the 4th century. This has been going on, even before that. Ebionites in the 2nd century, the Arius in the 4th century. Today, the Jehovah's Witnesses are still doing it. This has been a problem right through the church. So, but getting back to your thing, could this be ecumenism, or could this be an internecine confrontation between two different Christian groups, anti-Trinitarians versus Trinitarians? Huge question needs to be put up there. So the coins seem to suggest that this is an attack against the person of Jesus Christ, against the Trinity, and against his sonship, which is still going on today. Hasn't changed.
True. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it can be taken in either of those directions. And I'd be comfortable to go in either one of those directions. I think what's interesting is not only the lack of Islamic developments that's shown on the coin, as in you don't see reference to the Shahada, or the Bismillah, or Muhammad in the early coins, but rather you see references to people, like actual like icons of people, which again, Islamically doesn't seem to be in line with the Orthodox position on not having icons and drawings of people, particularly caliphs and whatnot. But then you then start to see that strip away and the Islamic development come in at the same time. So it's not just an absence of something; it's like a contradicting doctrine, right? You know, you have images of people which you can't have. That starts to go away, and now this Islamic message starts to appear.
And so this happens in between 693 and 696. After this, before this, what you didn't also bring up, in I don't know if you have Muawiyah's coin, but if you look at Muawiyah's coins, he's holding a cross. He has another cross at his head, and he has a cross above his head. What in the world is Muawiyah, a Muslim, doing with holding two crosses and also bearing a cross on his crown?
That is a very good point.
How can he be a Muslim if he has crosses? Okay, so that's another thing you need to put out there. There is either this is highly ecumenical, saying that we accept everybody, but then what's Islamic about it? I want to know still. I want to ask people, show me what's Islamic about these coins. Where is Muhammad here? Now, if he's introduced here, this is way in the late 7th century. This is 693. 692 is when it's first introduced. That's one coin before this. That's actually that shows it actually shows the Byzantine emperor with his two sons on either side. And they're supposed to have an orb with a cross on it. They've taken the cross piece off, and there you see the Shahada for the first time. That was minted in 692 by Abd al-Malik himself. This second one here is when he comes back from winning the war, and he comes back he's taken off Heraclius, he's taken off his two sons, and he's put himself on that coin. Again, that's highly iconographic, proving that there was no problem with icons, even as late as 693. From 696, which is the coin you have in the bottom there, then from that time on until today, no more icons. So this iconic problem with icons seemed to be introduced by Abd al-Malik in the late 7th century, I would say the last 4 years of the 7th century. Okay, anyway, good stuff. But getting back to what you're saying, it looks like there was either Islam just didn't even exist this early, or that this was still a vestige of a perverted form, or anachronistic form of Christianity, or some form of a sectarian view of Christianity, an Arian form of Christianity. We don't know. What we do know is there's an awful lot of allegiance to the person of Jesus Christ, and also an allegiance up until we get to this period. Now there seems to be attack against Jesus. Now there seems to be an attack against the Trinity. But that only comes in the last 10 years of the 7th century.
I think it was Patricia Crone who said, if you look at the early Muslim community, and if you ask them what they believed, they would tell you they believe in the Abraham, Isaac, Moses, Noah, and so on. And they believe in Jesus, and they believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And if you heard that, the average person would think that you're just a Christian. You might not be a Christian in, a Miaphysite sense, an Nestorian sense. I mean, that's obviously up for question, but you would be identified as a Christian. So it's interesting.
God bless. All right, Chris and Jay, over and out.